You ever wonder what it's like to feel invisible to the people who are supposed to love you the most? I don't mean in the moody, teenager slamming the bedroom door kind of way. I mean in a way where no matter what you do, you're just there. Like a piece of furniture. You're a fixture in the house, but not really part of it. That was my childhood in a nutshell. My parents always underestimated me. I'm not exaggerating when I say I can count the number of compliments I've gotten from them on one hand, and that includes the time I got straight A's in 9th grade and my dad said, didn't think you had it in you. That was about as good as it ever got. They weren't abusive, at least not in the yelling and throwing stuff kind of way. But the way they ignored me. Man, sometimes I think I would have preferred the screaming. At least that would have felt like something. It got worse after their divorce. They split when I was 13, and I could tell they didn't really know what to do with me. My mom got custody, but only because my dad didn't fight for me. I'll never forget overhearing him say to her, "He's probably better off with you." I don't have the energy for all that. I wasn't all that, by the way. I was quiet, kept to myself, and spent most of my time reading or drawing. But apparently, even existing was too much effort for him. My mom, though. She saw me as a paycheck. She didn't make much from her job, so my dad's child support checks became her lifeline. And I mean that literally. She didn't even try to hide it. Every time she got a payment, she'd immediately go out and buy herself something, new clothes, a manicure, sometimes even weekend trips. Meanwhile, I was walking around in sneakers with holes in them. I'd ask her for things I needed, just basic stuff like school supplies, and she'd wave me off with, "We can't afford that right now." But here's the thing that still stings: when I turned 18, the child support stopped. And so did my mom's interest in me. I had a son when I was 19. Yeah, I know, early, right? His mom and I weren't even together for that long. We were dumb kids who thought we had it all figured out. She bailed not long after he was born, which left me with a baby and no idea what the hell I was doing. But I loved that little guy. From the second I held him, I knew I'd do whatever it took to give him the life I didn't have. Now, here's where things get weird. My parents, the same ones who never cared about me, suddenly decided they had opinions about my son. My mom? She acted like he was some kind of burden. She'd roll her eyes whenever I brought him over, saying stuff like, "Don't think you can dump him on me. I've raised my kids, and I'm done." My dad, on the rare occasions he even acknowledged his grandson's existence, would just laugh and say, "Chip off the old block, huh? Good luck with that." But you know what they both did? They started asking me for money. At first, I thought it was a joke. My mom called me one night when my son, Jake, was about 2. She didn't even bother with pleasantries. Her exact words were, "Hey, I'm running a little low this month. Think you can send me a couple $100?" I remember just sitting there, dumbfounded, staring at the phone. A couple $100? At the time, I was working 2 part-time jobs, barely scraping by, and trying to figure out how to potty train a toddler without losing my mind. I didn't even have a couple $100 to my name. I told her that, thinking she'd understand. She didn't. "Oh, come on," she snapped. "You're a grown man now. You need to figure out how to manage your money better. It's not fair that I raised you and now you're just letting me struggle." Letting her struggle. I bit my tongue so hard I thought it might bleed. I wanted to tell her that she hadn't really raised me, she tolerated me. But I didn't say it. I just mumbled something about being tight on cash and hung up. Then my dad jumped on the bandwagon. He called me about a week later, sounding unusually cheerful. That should have been my first red flag. He said he'd heard about some promotion I'd gotten at one of my jobs, a tiny pay bump that barely covered gas, and he wanted to celebrate. "Why don't you take your old man out for a steak dinner?" he said. "I've had my eye on that new place downtown." I laughed, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. I told him I couldn't afford it, and he let out this dramatic sigh, like I'd just told him I ran over his dog. Then he hit me with, "You know, when I was your age, I used to help my parents. You're lucky you even have the option to help me." Lucky. That word hit me like a punch to the gut. Lucky to have parents who ignored me my entire childhood. Lucky to have a dad who couldn't even remember my birthday most years. I didn't say any of that, though. I just told him no. But here's where it gets wild. They didn't stop. Over the next few months, they each found increasingly creative ways to guilt-trip me into giving them money. My mom started calling me selfish anytime I said no. She even threw Jake into the mix, saying, "I can't believe you take food out of your own son's grandmother's mouth." As if that made sense. My dad. He tried the pity angle. He'd send me these texts about how lonely he was and how he just wanted to go out and enjoy himself but couldn't afford to on his fixed income. Fixed income, by the way, was his way of saying he didn't want to get a job. And then came the biggest twist of all, they teamed up. One day, I get a call from my mom and she says, "Your father and I were talking and we've decided that you need to start contributing more to the family." The family? Like they were some kind of united front now. I almost laughed, but I could hear in her voice that she was dead serious. "What do you mean by contributing?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Well," she said, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world, "we think it's only fair that you send us a portion of your paycheck every month. You're the only one in the family who's working full-time right now." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad chimed in at that point, saying, "Yeah, think of it like paying it forward. We took care of you for years and now it's your turn to take care of us." I was so angry I was shaking. I told them I wasn't going to do that, and my mom immediately started crying. Like, full-on sobbing, saying, "I can't believe my own son would abandon me like this. After everything I've done for you." And my dad? He just said, "You'll regret this someday. You'll see." I hung up on them. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. These were my parents. They were supposed to be the people I could turn to when life got hard. Instead, they were turning into people I actively had to avoid. But if I thought that was bad, I had no idea what they had in store for me next. After that call, I decided to set some boundaries. I figured if I just kept my distance, they'd eventually get the hint. Spoiler, they didn't. The first couple of months were quiet. Too quiet. I didn't hear much from either of them, and honestly, it was kind of a relief. I focused on Jake, trying to give him a childhood that didn't feel like walking on eggshells. But then my mom called one day, and she sounded a different. Softer. "Hey," she said. I was thinking. Maybe I haven't been fair to you. I nearly dropped my phone. I had never heard her admit to being unfair. Ever. She went on, saying she realized she'd been too hard on me, that she just wanted to rebuild our relationship. "I miss Jake," she said. "I want to be a part of his life. Do you think we could come over this weekend? Maybe have dinner?" I'll admit, I fell for it. I mean, it's not like I didn't want my son to have grandparents. And for a moment, I thought maybe she'd actually changed. So I said yes. That Saturday, she showed up with my dad in tow. No warning. Just the two of them standing on my doorstep like the last 6 months of manipulation hadn't happened. I almost slammed the door in their faces, but then Jake ran up behind me, yelling, "Grandma! Grandpa!" I didn't want to ruin his excitement, so I let them in. For the first hour or so, everything was fine. They played with Jake, complimented the dinner I'd made, and even asked me how work was going. It felt normal. Too normal. Then, right as Jake ran off to play with his toys, my dad leaned back in his chair and said, "So, about that monthly contribution we talked about." I stared at him, stunned. "Are you serious right now?" He shrugged like it was no big deal. "We're just saying, it'd help a lot. You know how expensive things are these days." My mom chimed in, "We're not asking for much. Just a couple $100 a month. It's not like you don't have it." I stood up so fast my chair nearly tipped over. "You're kidding, right? You came here, played nice, just to hit me up for money again. In front of my kid." Jake must have heard the anger in my voice because he came back into the room, clutching his stuffed dinosaur. "Daddy, are you mad?" I looked at his little face and realized I couldn't do this in front of him. I told my parents it was time to leave. My mom started to argue, but I cut her off. "Out. Now. As they walked to the door, my dad muttered something about me being ungrateful, and my mom just shook her head like I was some kind of lost cause. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. A week later, I got a call from Jake's daycare. They said a woman claiming to be his grandmother had shown up unannounced, saying she wanted to take him out for ice cream. I felt like my stomach dropped out of my body. "Did you let her take him?" she asked, my voice shaking. "Of course not," the woman said. "She didn't have any authorization. But she caused a bit of a scene when we wouldn't let her in." I hung up and immediately called my mom. She didn't even deny it. "I just wanted to spend some time with him," she said, like that made it okay. "You don't get to just take him," I yelled. "You can't show up like that without telling me." "Well, maybe if you weren't being so difficult, I wouldn't have to," she snapped. That was it. I told her she wasn't allowed near Jake anymore unless I explicitly said so. No visits, no calls, nothing. She started crying, of course, saying I was punishing her, but I didn't care. I was done. Or so I thought. A few weeks later, I came home from work to find a letter in my mailbox. It was from a lawyer. My parents were suing me for grandparents' rights. When I opened that letter and saw the words grandparents' rights, I honestly thought it was a prank. I mean, who sues their own kid for the right to see their grandchild? But no, it was very real. My parents had actually hired a lawyer and filed a petition. I didn't know much about grandparents' rights at the time, so I did what any panicked person would do, I Googled it. Turns out, in some states, grandparents can sue for visitation rights if they can prove it's in the child's best interest. I couldn't believe it. These were the same people who barely wanted to acknowledge my existence growing up, and now they were fighting to be in my kid's life. I called their lawyer to try and reason with them. Big mistake. The guy was polite but firm, saying, "Your parents feel that you are unfairly preventing them from maintaining a relationship with their grandson." "I'm not preventing anything," I snapped. "I just don't want them showing up unannounced or trying to take him out of daycare without my permission." "Well," he said, "that's something the court can help sort out." So that's how I ended up in court with my own parents. The first hearing was surreal. My mom showed up in this overly dramatic black dress, like she was attending a funeral, and my dad had the nerve to wear a suit and tie, something he'd never even bothered to do for my high school graduation. Their lawyer painted this picture of them as loving, doting grandparents who were being unfairly cut off by their unreasonable son. My mom even cried on the stand, saying, "All I want is to see my grandson." Is that so much to ask? When it was my turn, I told the judge everything. How they'd ignored me growing up, how they tried to guilt-trip me for money, how my mom had shown up at Jake's daycare without permission. I thought that would be enough to end things right then and there. It wasn't. The judge said we'd need a full hearing to evaluate the situation. In the meantime, he suggested we try mediation. I didn't want to, but my lawyer said it was better to look cooperative, so I agreed. Mediation was a disaster. My parents refused to take any responsibility for their actions. My mom kept saying, "I don't understand why he's so angry with us," and my dad just sat there with his arms crossed, glaring at me like I was some unruly teenager. Finally, I snapped. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about me being angry. It's about protecting my son. You can't just treat him like some prop you get to use whenever it's convenient for you." My dad leaned forward and said, "Maybe if you weren't such a selfish little brat, we wouldn't be in this mess." The mediator quickly stepped in, but the damage was done. I knew there was no reasoning with them. The full hearing was scheduled for a few weeks later, and in the meantime, I started documenting everything. Every text, every voicemail, every weird stunt they pulled. I even got a copy of the daycare's incident report from the day my mom tried to take Jake. When the day of the hearing finally came, I was ready. Or at least I thought I was. My parents' lawyer went all out, accusing me of alienating Jake from his grandparents and claiming I was using him as a pawn to punish them. At one point, my mom started sobbing again, saying, "I just want him to know how much we love him." But when it was my turn, I didn't hold back. I told the judge about the constant requests for money, the guilt-tripping, the daycare incident, everything. I even read out some of their nastier texts, like the one where my dad said I was raising a spoiled brat just like myself. By the end of it, the judge looked more annoyed than anything. He told my parents that while grandparents' rights were important, their behavior showed a clear lack of respect for my role as Jake's parent. The petition was denied. You'd think that would be the end of it, right? That they'd finally back off. Nope. That's when they decided to take things to a whole new level. After the judge denied their petition, I thought I'd finally be free. I even let myself believe, just for a moment, that they'd finally take the hint and leave me and Jake alone. I was wrong. The silence lasted for about a month. Then one day, I came home from work and noticed something strange. My mailbox was stuffed with letters, handwritten ones, all from my mom. I didn't open them right away. I just tossed them on the counter, figuring they were more guilt-tripping attempts. But the next day, more showed up. And the day after that. I finally opened one, and it was exactly what I expected, a long, rambling letter about how I was robbing Jake of a loving relationship with his family and how I'd regret it someday. But what really got to me was the last line, "If you don't fix this, we will." I didn't know what that meant, but it didn't sit right with me. Then things escalated. A few days later, I noticed a car parked across the street from my house. It was a beat-up old sedan I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it belonged to a neighbor or maybe someone visiting the area. But then I saw it again the next day. And the day after that. I started to get paranoid. I even asked one of my neighbors if they'd seen anything weird, but they just shrugged and said no. That night, I stayed up late, watching out the window. Around midnight, I saw someone get out of the car. It was my dad. I was furious. I stormed outside, yelling, "What the hell are you doing here?" He froze like a deer in headlights, then quickly tried to play it off. "Oh, I was just driving by. Thought I'd stop and see how you're doing." At midnight. I snapped. He muttered something about just wanting to make sure Jake was okay and then got in his car and drove off. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I called the police to file a report. They told me they couldn't do much since he hadn't technically broken any laws, but they advised me to get a security camera just in case. So I did. I set up a few cameras around the house, hoping it would be enough to deter them. It wasn't. A week later, I came home to find my back door wide open. My heart dropped. Jake was with a babysitter at the time, so I knew he was safe, but the idea that someone had been in my house was terrifying. I called the police immediately. When they arrived, they found no signs of forced entry. Nothing was missing, but there were muddy footprints leading from the back door to Jake's room. And sitting on his bed, a stuffed animal I'd never seen before. That was it. That was the final straw. I called my lawyer the next morning and filed for a restraining order against both of them. It was granted almost immediately, thanks to the daycare incident, the harassment, and now the break-in. When my parents were served the papers, my mom called me, sobbing and begging me to drop it. "We just wanted to make sure Jake knows we love him," she wailed. I told her I didn't care. "If you come near us again, I'll call the police. Don't test me." Since then, they've stayed away. I've blocked their numbers, changed my locks, and added more security cameras. I even moved to a new neighborhood just to be safe. Jake doesn't ask about them much, and when he does, I keep it simple. "They are not nice people," I tell him. "And it's my job to keep you safe." I used to feel guilty about cutting them off. I'd wonder if I was being too harsh, if maybe I could have handled things differently. But then I look at Jake, at his big, happy smile, and I know I did the right thing. Some people say family is everything. But I've learned the hard way that family isn't about blood. It's about the people who love you, respect you, and make you feel safe. And sometimes, the best thing you can do is walk away.